Imagine waking in the dark with a single task. Keep one glowing ember alive until morning. No lighters, no matches, just a quiet thread of heat between survival and cold. Tonight, we'll follow the people who carried fire for days, moving a spark across mountains and seasons. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments. I love seeing how far our small campfire reaches. Now, settle in, breathe slowly, and let's walk with the ember carriers of the Stone Age. Before lighters and matches, before steel struck sparks from stone, the idea of making fire on demand was more hope than habit. A bow drill could squeal for an hour and still yield nothing but smoke and frustration. A hand drill asked for skin, stamina, and perfect conditions. The fire plow punished impatience. Damp tinder laughed at confidence. If you needed heat in driving rain, in thin mountain air, after a night of sleet or a day of exhaustion, the odds were against you. So people learned not to gamble. They learned to keep what they already had. Carrying fire, guarding a coal through distance and weather, wasn't a romantic flourish. It was risk management, a quiet insurance policy against the brutal unpredictability of ignition. The ember was time saved, calories saved, and sometimes lives saved. Because in a world where failure meant shivering hunger and infections untreated by warmth, reliability was everything. Warmth was only the beginning. Fire softened roots, detoxified bitter tubers, released more energy from meat, and turned tough grains digestible. Smoke kept midges and mosquitoes at bay, and its smell clung to hides and hair as a built-in insect repellent that followed people on the trail. A tended ember promised light that could be coaxed up quickly when a cry went up in the night or when someone returned late from foraging. It promised the ability to dry soaked clothing and to harden wooden spear points by gently toasting their tips. It made glue, pitch, and resin possible, which made reliable tools possible, which meant better hunts and safer shelters. Without a carried coal, the decision to stop and rest wherever dusk found you became a wager with cold, damp, and darkness. With one, a new hearth could breathe within minutes, bringing the small civilizing circle that predators, even curious ones, tended to respect. There is a social gravity to fire that's easy to underestimate. Heat drew bodies inward, yes, but the stable center of a flame drew talk inward too. Plans, stories, and warnings traveled more easily when everyone sat in a ring with eyes on the same moving light, when hands were free to gesture and the night quieted around the crackle. To carry an ember was to carry a meeting place, a portable hearth that could be restarted at the next camp and the next, so that the rhythm of a group eat, mend, tell, sleep, could be resumed wherever the day ended. Children learned boundaries at the edge of the glow, learned patience by blowing coals to life, learned caution by watching the adults' practiced movements around heat. From a distance, a campfire was a beacon. Up close, it was a school. And if a band scattered to scout or to follow migrating herds, a ready ember meant the parent with the toddler didn't have to wait on the return of a fire maker. It meant the injured hunter could warm water for herbs immediately. It meant grief and celebration both had the candles they required without delay. Geography magnified the need. In damp forests where tinder never truly dried, in highlands where wind bit straight through hides, on coasts where fog soaked fiber as fast as you could twist it, the difference between a smouldering coal and none at all was the difference between confidence and constant contingency. Consider the daily energy budget of a small group already stretched thin by foraging and walking. Failing to make fire once might cost an hour and a handful of precious calories. Failing 3 times after a storm might cost the whole day, pushing fatigue into the next, eroding attention, making accidents more likely, and fraying tempers at the worst possible time. A single ember, banked in ash, turned that cascade off like a valve. With it, mornings could be predictable. Stir the coals, lay the kindling, and watch the thin breath of smoke swell into a flame. Breakfast hissing in its light. Predictability is underrated. It frees attention for navigation, for tracking, for reading weather, for noticing the quiet shine of ripe fruit behind a thorn tangle. It also expands a map. Groups that knew they could regenerate flame quickly dared push farther into cold latitudes and higher elevations, inhabiting places where making fire from scratch was a seasonal hardship. The ember was a bridge into environments that would otherwise reject you on wet days and starve you on long nights. It meant that the pack carried not only tools but continuity. Yesterday's heat becoming today's, today's becoming tomorrow's. An unbroken thread through landscapes that would have preferred you to pass through and vanish. Even the micro moments mattered. A traveler who slips crossing a stream can, shivering on the other bank, nurse a coal into flame and dry out before hypothermia creeps in. A downpour that breaks an afternoon can be waited out under rock with confidence, knowing that a coal, protected in its cradle, will still breathe when the skies lighten. A sudden bounty, fish pulled from a narrowing pool, a bird brought down at dusk, doesn't spoil, because the camp can roast immediately, and fire's less tangible gifts follow too. Smoke to tan hides, gentle heat to keep sinew pliable for bowstrings, the steady warmth that makes nursing easier for a mother and infant when wind slips under the shelter edge. People watched animals respond to fire, the wary distance of hyenas, the way big cats kept to the periphery, and understood that carrying a coal all meant carrying a perimeter. Not an absolute one, but a persuasive one, buying time and comfort and the courage to sleep more deeply than the open dark usually allowed. The ember was a tool, a weapon of sorts, a companion, and a symbol. And these weren't separate categories in daily life. They braided together each time someone cupped a hand around a smolder and blew. Each time another hand layered bark and grass to feed it. Each time the first tongues of flame licked up, and the smell of warming wood reached everyone at once, and shoulders dropped a little. And with that certainty sitting in their palms, people could think about more than survival for the next hour. They could carve, teach, plan a hunt that reached past the next hill, look at the line of geese arrowing overhead, and feel not only hunger, but timing, seasons, roots, all while the ember, the quiet heart of the day, waited, patient, ready to be transferred to its next cradle. At the day's last glow, when the cooking flames have fallen inward and the talk has thinned to murmurs, someone kneels to read the hearth like a map. The surface ash is pale and deceptive, a blanket that hides a dozen red hearts beating at different speeds. A careful hand skims across with a stick, listening for that muted hiss that means heat, noting where the ash collapses with a soft sigh and reveals a vein of color. You don't grab the brightest coal. Brightness means appetite, a coal that wants to leap into flame if given the slightest wind. What you want is depth, a cherry red without frantic edges, a glow that steadies after a breath instead of racing. The best coals come from wood that burned slow and dense. Oak, beech, acacia, any timber that left a heavy, clean charcoal, rather than the flaky black crust of fast-burning brush. A good hearth has been managed all evening with this in mind, built on stones that hold heat, fed with thicker pieces. As the meal finished, the fire pushed apart into zones, flame for quick boiling, coals for roasting, and a quiet corner where chunks were allowed to carbonize patiently for the night's travel. The coal picker keeps a small rake, a forked stick, a sliver of antler, sometimes a flat scallop of bone, used to tease the embers apart without scattering sparks. With the rake, you clear a circle, roll candidates out of the tangle, and let each sit a moment in the open air to show its character. Some reveal a brittle shell that caves in at a tap. Some go dull too quickly, announcing that their heat is shallow. Some spit a hot fleck and are rejected immediately, because spitting embers can destroy a bundle or burn a carrier's forearm on a windy path. You tap, turn, nudge, and wait, letting your breath be the measure. A slow exhale across the ember's face is a test and a kind of greeting. Too eager a flare, and it's not yet quiet enough. Too weak a response, and it will die in the bundle. A good ember answers your breath with a deepening red and the smallest expanding ring of light, then settles back without smoke that bites the eyes. The ashes you brushed aside are not waste, but tool. Fine ash is insulation, a dry powder that moderates hunger, and the task now is to pack a little of it where it matters. You make a shallow dish of ash in the palm of your hand or in a bark scoop. Set the chosen coal into it like an egg, and dust over the top with a veil thin enough that the ember still shows its glow through the powder. It makes a dull, sealed look, the egg turned fossil, and you can feel a faint, steady warmth through the bark. If the night is damp and the air heavy, you add a touch more ash. If the wind is sharp and drying, less is needed because a bundle in motion will breathe on its own. Around the ash egg, you build the cradling fibers. The innermost nest is from materials that don't flash into flame but accept heat and smolder. Shredded inner bark from lime or cedar, scraped with a stone until it separates into silky threads. Dry grass rubbed between palms to make a down. The soft brown heart of rotten wood pounded into felt. Or a strip of fungus dried until it's light as parchment and will carry a coal through miles with gentle persuasion. Everything wet is useless, so the day's gathering included pockets of tinder kept under cloaks and near bodies, dried by warmth and protected from fog. You lay a wisp of this material beneath the ember, a cushion that keeps the coal from drawing heat away into a cold container, and then fold strands over the top, never pressing hard, only letting the fibers rest like thatch. Air channels matter. You want tiny pathways where breath can slip and wake the ember without finding a chimney to flare. Hands do the measuring, but ears help too. Listen for the faint shift in sound as powder settles and fibers whisper. A too dull silence hints at suffocation. A soft purr means the ember is breathing. If there is a reed or hollow bone at hand, a thin elder tube with the pith pushed out, a clean bird bone saved for this purpose. Set it against the edge of the bundle, not the ember itself, so later you can feed a thread of air directly where it is needed without disturbing the wrappings. Next comes the outer skin, different from the nest and chosen for strength. A piece of birch bark curled into a cone and pinned with a thorn makes a light, weather-shedding case. A small gourd, its neck cut clean, and a perforated stopper carved to let it breathe, is better in rain. A stitched pouch of rawhide hardens into a protective shell after many smokings, and if it has a few tiny, deliberate punctures, it becomes a living container, not sealed, not open, but somewhere in between. Clay, when a band has it, is shaped into thumb-sized cups or lidded pots baked at a hearth's edge until the walls ring when tapped. Those are for long journeys, or when the ember will ride on an animal rather than a shoulder. Whatever the vessel, there is always a way to bleed air in and heat out slowly. Before the bundle is stowed, the ember is asked one last question. You loosen the wrap enough to see a dull glow. Tilt the package and give 3 small breaths through the reed, watching for a response that is calm and certain. Not a flash, not a smoke gout, not a collapse, but that quiet deepening that tells you the coal is still itself, inside all that gentleness. If it answers well, you close the bundle again and roast the outside a moment above the residual heat of the hearth, not to burn it, but to chase any clinging damp, to set the fibers into a memory of warmth so they don't suck life from the ember with their cold. While this happens, someone else prepares the path for the ember's keeper. The sling or bandolier is checked, a loop that keeps the container snug against the chest, where body heat steadies temperature and where arms can shield it from wind gusts. If the carrier walks with a staff, the staff may have a fork near the top, a resting shelf where the container can perch when hands are needed for climbing. Clothing is arranged to create a pocket of air. No bundle likes to be smothered by a heavy fold that traps moisture. The first steps from the camp are a test in motion. The ember behaves differently as you walk, the puff and lull of your stride feeding it in pulses. Long practice teaches a pace that doesn't pump too much air through the tiny holes and doesn't starve the coal on steep ascents. In wind, you carry the opening downwind. In drizzle, you turn the opening inside, trusting the bark or gourd to shed. If a gust blows ash away from the coal, you can feel it in the way the warmth leaps against your palm, and you react without thinking. Tilt, cover, breathe, wait, and then dust a fresh pinch of ash from the pouch tied at your belt. That pouch is as important as any knife. It holds fine ash, a twist of dry fungus, a few curls of inner bark, and a sliver of charcoal for emergencies. Along the trail, low stops keep the ember honest. At the break of a hill or under a leaning rock, you squat and listen, the world narrowing until the only thing that matters is the ember's small language. If it sounds faint, you open a seam, let it taste a breath, and close it again. If it's too eager, you feed it a little more ash and a few breaths through pursed lips to calm it, because fast coals burn short lives. In saturated weather, you sometimes warm the bundle against your ribs, trading a little of your heat to the coal so it doesn't have to eat itself to stay alive. In hot, dry air, you shield it more, because a rush of oxygen will spark a flame that can char the nest and ruin the carry. Back at the emptying hearth, the rest of the coals are banked. This is part of catching a cold, too. You don't let the mother fire die all at once. Stones are moved to trap heat. Bigger chunks set close and covered in ash so that, if the night forces a return, there will be a reserve waiting. The site remembers you by its warmth. You leave it that way when you can. The person with the bundle isn't alone with the task. Eyes follow them in the last light, a quiet acknowledgement passing that this is a shared future riding in a small cradle. A child might hold breath and mimic the motions, practicing with a cold pebble and a curl of bark, learning that even pretend embers demand gentle hands. Elders murmur advice disguised as stories, how a sudden valley wind once ate a coal, and how turning the opening to the hollow of the collarbone saved another. How a reed clogged with soot taught patience. How a lodestone tucked in a pouch became habit because north makes for steady walking. These are not superstitions so much as mnemonic hooks, ways to keep fragile knowledge attached to memory. As darkness finally thickens, the glow inside the carrier's bundle is no longer visible, but it is felt in the small, even warmth. In the absence of worry. The ember has been caught, not trapped, and it will ride calmly as long as it is treated like something alive, which in a way it is. It breathes, it eats, it sleeps, it wakes, it responds to care. Each step down the path reinforces the rhythm between walker and coal. Move, pause, listen, breathe, until even the night air seems to adapt to that quiet cadence, and the world beyond the lane of your travel becomes only shapes and smells and the steady pulse of heat at your chest, waiting for the next moment when it will be asked to bloom. Among the many small alliances people formed with the landscape, a quiet one grew between humans and the shelf fungi that stepped like little balconies up tree trunks. The first discovery was probably an accident, a fallen bracket, sun-dried and light as cork, tucked near a cooking fire for kindling, and found later, still breathing a thin coal inside itself, unwilling to flash into open flame, yet unwilling to die. It was a temperament perfectly matched to travel. People learn to recognize the right growths at a glance, the ones with a sober, woody heft and fine pores below, not the flimsy caps that turned to nothing after rain. On birch trunks, pale rolls of fungus promised clean, even smolder. On old beeches and maples, hard hoof-shaped shelves, grey outside and brown within, offered a felt-like flesh that loved to cradle heat. A good collector carried a knife that was more wedge than blade, suited for prying rather than slicing, because you never wanted to scar a living tree more than necessary. You cut high when possible, taking from the older plates and leaving the younger to grow on. The cut pieces rode home strapped to a pack frame, their edges turned outward to dry in the moving air. And as they cured, they lost weight until a bag of them felt like a sack of feathers that nonetheless held a planet's patience. Drying was a season unto itself. In damp climates, racks were built from crossed twigs and set near the hearth where smoke could slip among the stacked rounds and persuade insects to leave. The smell became a sign of readiness, a sweet, woody fragrance that hinted at leather and rain. And when you pressed a thumb into the cut face, there was a give without softness, like pressing old bread that still remembers an oven. Some pieces became tinder, meant to catch the smallest spark. Others were reserved for slow carrying, chosen for their stubborn refusal to flare. The inner flesh was teased into layers with the tip of a bone awl, a patient unpeeling that exposed a woolly heart. If the band had ashlie made from water boiled with the sifted white powder from last night's fire, the softer pieces were soaked and then beaten against a flat stone until they opened like felt. That felt, called by many names in many places, loved embers the way dry moss loves dew, wicking heat along its fibers and holding it close without the greed that consumes. Sometimes the felt was rubbed with a pinch of fine charcoal to deepen its heat paths, sometimes with the faintest smear of animal fat to help it shrug off fog. Each family had its own opinion, its own inherited gestures. Even without felt, the whole slices were useful. A coal pressed into the porous underside found 1,000 tiny rooms to haunt, each pore a little respiratory sac that let it breathe without gulping. If a slow match of twisted fiber was threaded through the pores and touched to the coal, the smoulder crept along the braid at a human pace, the time it takes to tell a story or to cross a valley, and could be pinched and restarted as often as needed. Birch brought its own partners to the work. From its white bark, rolled into cones, you could make cases that shed water. From its trunks came another fungus, soft and clean, used to dress cuts and line ember nests. Birch and fungus and human hand became a triad of reliability, each answering the other's weaknesses. In conifer forests, resinous woods offered torches, but their fungi were less cooperative, so travelers carried their shelf allies from hardwood groves, swapping and gifting them at meetings like seeds. The knowledge that one kind smoked too acridly in small spaces, that another went out when packed too tightly, that a third would spit if harvested after the first frost. These were specifics a band held close, testing them anew with each year because trees change with weather. And a wet spring writes a different story into the growth than a dry one. Children learn to look at trunks the way trackers look at soil. What tree, how old, how sunlit, what companions at its roots. The best finds lived on the north sides of trees where growth was slow and tight. The worst were swollen from too much rain, a sponge that turned to mush at the first hint of breath. When a basket came back full, the choice of which pieces to keep was done by ear as much as eye. Tap the cut face with a knuckle and listen. Hollow, too light. Dull thud, too wet. A small, satisfying wooden chime. Put that one aside. Then a heat test. Hold a sliver near an ember and wait. The right kind of smoke smells like tea and leather, thin and blue. The wrong kind is greasy and thick and makes eyes water. A good piece will darken slowly, blush into a glow, and then, when lifted away, keep that interior red for the space of a breath, asking for neither panic nor neglect. Alongside the fungi, punk wood, the brown heart of logs that have surrendered their rigidity, was harvested and dried to a friable cake that, when crumbled, blended beautifully with fungal felt. The mixture made a bedding that was forgiving of mistakes, a bed that could absorb a sudden flare and calm it, or take a failing coal and coax it back without drama. In wetter places, cattail fluff was sometimes stirred in, but only a pinch. Too much fluff and the bundle would cough itself into flame, charring the very cradle meant to help. Carriers developed small routines that turned the fungi from materials into companions. A favored slice might be shaved carefully around a browned crater so its lung was refreshed, much as you scrape a pot to keep it clean for the next stew. Edges were trimmed to fit a known container, and a slice, once paired with a birch cone or a gourd, often lived in that home for weeks, taking on the scent of smoke and leather, a reassuring smell when storms blackened the sky. Some travelers marked the backs with tiny cuts, one nick for a cooperative piece, two for a piece that needed more ash than usual to keep it civil, so that in the dark a quick touch told a story. At camps where time allowed, a few slices were taught deliberately. You set a coal and nurse it through a day, feeding just enough air that the heat walks the fungal pathways. Then you rest it. Then you wake it again. After a few cycles, that piece seems to know, or so people said with a smile as if admitting a superstition. And thereafter it catches and carries more predictably. Whether or not it is truly taught, the person is, and the hands become better at reading the same subtle signs over and over until a kind of friendship exists between skin and mycelial grain. Harvesting had its courtesies. Never strip a tree bare. Never take from a trunk where woodpeckers feed, because your convenience can starve a neighbor, and the forest will balance books in ways you might not like later. Never gather after a lightning strike, because those fungi often hide pockets of moisture that betray you at a critical moment. Leave a piece wedged in a nearby fork for the next traveler who may come cold and alone. What you give today, you may find waiting in a different wood next season. Pieces carried through rain take on a grim, mottled look, and those are not discarded but retired to the hearthside store, where they can serve as tinder testers for children or as slow smoke for curing meat. In winter, when resin hardens and the air is knife dry, the fungi ask for gentler breath. In summer, when heat is lazy and thunderheads gross, they accept more ash and a tighter wrap. The living sense of the thing is constant. Treat the fungus as a breathing thing, and it will behave like one, tolerating travel but disliking shocks, thriving on routine, sulking a little when neglected, and then forgiving you if you come back with patience. On long moves, when the band flowed over ridgelines and down into new basins, the fungal carriers connected the days. Morning meant checking the slice that had ridden all night, tapping its edge to shed spent powder, brushing on a fresh veil of ash, and listening for that soft inner hush when the ember settles. Midday meant a pause where a child could blow gently and watch the pores blush one by one, each tiny dot a star appearing in a grey sky. Dusk meant the ceremonial transfer, the hot heart from the day's keeper's piece pressed into kindling, flames licking up, supper on, and then full circle, the evening's chosen coal bedded back into the same slice or into a fresh one, a relay where the baton is not gripped but cradled. Even far from the trees that birthed them, those shelves felt like pieces of home, little bits of forest logic carried across open grass and stony riverbeds. Their slow confidence shaped the tempo of travel, making room for glances up at migrating birds and for the long, braided talk that turns strangers into kin. And when someone, bleary and grateful, woke before dawn to relight the hearth while the world still held its breath, the first real sound of the morning was often a polite crackle stepping out of a grey disk of fungus, as if the forest itself had reached across the night to help begin the day. Ash is both blanket and language. It looks like a simple grey powder, but in practiced hands, it becomes a lid that breathes, a throttle for hunger, a way of telling heat to slow down without putting it to sleep. Fine ash poured through a woven sieve, fingers for a sieve if you have none, falls like snow and settles into every crease, smoothing edges, closing wide pores, and leaving slender pathways for air. You want the ash from hard, clean burns, the white siftings left after dense wood has given all it has. Soft, fluffy ash from brushy fires is too greedy with moisture and can clump into wet paste on damp days. People kept little packets of the good stuff in twist-knotted leaves or in tiny bark envelopes saved from last night's banked hearth, always dry, always within reach. To build a bundle, you start with stillness. Lay out what you need where your knees and hands can find them in the dark. A palm-sized pad of inner bark teased to down, a wisp of dry grass carded between the hands until it floats, a flake of punkwood crumbled to meal, a thin slice of fungus prepared earlier, a wrapper of birch or other pliant bark that will fold without cracking, a pinch pile of ash and a reed or hollow bone if you have one. The ember, chosen for depth and steadiness, sits to the side on a flat stone, breathing its slow red. The first touch is ash. Dust the ember lightly, turning it with a stick or a sliver of antler so its whole surface wears a veil. Not a coat so thick that the glow disappears, not a sprinkle so thin that a breath would sweep it bare. Somewhere in between, a frost that you can still see through. The ash cools the ember's skin and narrows its appetite without chilling its heart. Next comes the nest. Think of it as springs and spaces rather than padding. You want dozens of tiny rooms where heat can drift and settle, where the ember will meet new fibers in a slow courtship instead of a sudden rush. Lay the fungal slice porous side up and dust it with a little punk meal so the pores get a taste. On top of that, arrange the inner bark fibers in a loose spiral so that air has a path that winds rather than darts, and tuck a few grass hairs crosswise to keep the shape from collapsing. Make a little cup with your thumb. Set the ashed ember into it, then fold the edges of the nest over like a blanket, drawn to the chin of a sleeping child. Pause and listen. Does the ember's glow pulse slower now, deepening and easing back with your breath? Or does it darken too fast? If it darkens, open a seam with the tip of your finger and wait for the color to return. If it flares, pinch a pinch of ash between finger and thumb and let it snow down until the flare softens. The wrapper is not just weather skin, it's a governor. Birch bark is ideal where you have it. Thin, flexible, indifferent to drizzle. Curl it into a cone that overlaps by the width of 2 fingers. Then stitch or pin it with a thorn so the seam can be opened and closed without tearing. Before you close the cone, decide where the ember will face. You want the reed or bone set so that its mouth sits near, but not against, the ember's nest. Push the tube through a small hole you twist into the bark with a charred stick. Then seal the edges of the hole with a smear of fine clay or plant gum rubbed thin so it won't drip when warm. 2 or 3 pinholes made with a thistle spine on the opposite side create a slow cross draft. Too many holes, and the bundle hums itself into hunger. too few, and it sulks. Tie the cone with a thong of rawhide or a cord from twisted nettle, not tight, but confident, the way you tie a sleeping infant's wrap. If rain is certain, rub the outside lightly with fats so water beads and runs. Don't let fat find the inner nest. Greasy fibers encourage flare if the ember wakes suddenly. Now the ash blanket proper. Once the bundle is formed, you roll it along a palm of sifted ash so a thin layer clings to the inner bark fibers just beneath the wrapper. This isn't for the ember directly. It's for the pathways around it, so any heat that creeps outward is met by cool grey that tells it to slow. If the night will be windy, fold a second wrapper of bark over the first with the pinholes misaligned so gusts meet a labyrinth instead of a hallway. If the air is heavy with wet, make the pinholes slightly larger than a seed and face them inward toward your chest when you carry. Your body heat helps draw a tiny draft through the tube and out the holes. Altitude changes everything, and people notice. Higher air can be thin, and thin air tempts a carrier to blow too hard through the reed. The ash blanket forgives some of that. Its pores sip rather than gulp, but a better trick is to hum a note into the tube rather than blow, the vibration waking the ember gently, without throwing sparks. In thick forest, where air sits close and green, you reverse the habit. Smaller pinholes, more frequent rests to air the bundle. A few grains of crumbled charcoal fed into the nest like pepper to extend the ember's reach. When packing for travel, some make twins. 2 small bundles ride instead of one, each with a slightly different personality. One with a tighter ash skin for difficult weather, one looser for quick relights. They trade duties through the day, so neither burns itself down to nothing. The spare rides deeper in the pack, wrapped in a skin bag with a palm of warm ash at its base. The working bundle rides higher where a hand can find it without looking. The ash in the skin bag is not filler. It smooths jolts, cradling the shell, so vibration doesn't shake the nest into collapse. Adjustments are a conversation in scents and sounds. A sweet, thin smoke that tastes like tea means the ember is content. A sharp, scratchy smoke that stings the nose says fibers are charring too fast inside the tight places. If you hear a faint tick-tick, that is often a spark trying to climb. Open the seam and dust liberally, then press the edges back with the heel of your hand to settle the ash like snow sliding into crevices. A bundle that sighs when you squeeze it, exhaling a soft puff through the pinholes, is breathing well. A bundle that wheezes when you try to blow into the tube is choked with soot and needs the reed reamed with a twig. Every stop on the path is a chance to tend. You rest the bundle on a flat rock, never on damp earth. Roll it gently to let the ash inside find new perches. If a sunbreak opens, you bare the outer wrapper and let warmth chase off any dew that crept under. On cold mornings, you cup it between your palms to share heat. On hot, dry afternoons, you shade it and keep steps shorter so pulses of air through the holes don't overfeed it. If you must cross water, hold it high and keep the pinholes turned away from the wind of your motion. Once across, crack the seam a finger's width and feed the ember 3 slow breaths, counting between them. Then reseal and dust a little ash inside the seam where your breath warmed it. Communities have small rituals that make the work steady. Before sleep, someone beds the ember for the night. Open the cone, brush the nest with fresh ash, tuck in a shaving of punkwood the size of a fingernail, and close it with a murmured proverb that children whisper back, a rhythm more than words that keeps hands slow and motions in order. In heavy storms, the bundle may be buried awake, set into a shallow bowl of ash near, not in, the hearth pit, then covered with a breathable dome of bark and a hide. The ember sleeps like that, watched by whoever wakes to turn in the night, and in the grey before dawn, the dome lifts and the ember answers as if no time passed. Ash teaches thrift. If a coal grows too eager, you do not punish it with suffocating force. You coax it with more ash and cooler fibers. You widen the path so heat spreads sideways into the blanket rather than charging upward into flame. If it sulks, you do not rip the wrapper open and blow panic into its face. You edge the reed a finger width closer, give it a hum of breath, and sprinkle a line of charcoal meal that works like a wick. Only when patience fails do you resort to the drastic. Pinch a coal from the heart with tongs, wake a torch to calm the nest, then rebuild with fresh fibers and more measured holes. The craft spreads to the materials themselves. Inner bark from different trees gives different blankets. Lime's fibers are silky and even. Cedars split into ribbons that spring back. Elms can be beaten soft, but demand more ash. Mountain moss, once dried crisp, makes a plush that holds ash like a sky holds stars. Swamp moss, dried poorly, turns woolly and smokes harsh. Dry leaves of certain ferns crumble into flakes that slip into the spaces between fibers and make the nest denser without smothering it. On coasts, kelp ribs dried in wind form flexible slats that can be woven into an outer cage, a skeleton that keeps a bundle from being crushed in a crowded carry. Even the cordage you tie with matters. Nettle cord swells slightly with damp and conceal a seam tight in rain. Rawhide shrinks as it dries by the fire and can squeeze a bundle cruelly if you forget to loosen it at dusk. When several families travel together, the ash itself becomes a kind of shared inheritance. Each hearth's ash has a character, the flavor of the wood burned there, the mix of herbs tossed in, the way the fire was tended, and a pinch of one camp's ash blended into another's is like friendliness made visible. People swear that a blend behaves better than a single source, that the powder carries memory, like a story, carries advice, and so they trade tiny envelopes lined with leaves and stitched with grass, laughing about the temper of each batch the way they would about a relative. Handling ash makes hands grey, then clean again when brushed, and the look of those hands is a badge. These are hands that know the line between enough and too much, between a coal coddled into weakness and a coal driven into hunger. The sense extends to where you carry. A chest sling keeps the bundle in the draught of your own breath. A shoulder satchel lets swing do some of the air work for you, but can jostle the nest on steep descents. Some tuck the cone into a crook sewn inside a cloak, so the body makes a windbreak and a drip edge. In bitter cold, the bundle rides close to skin beneath layers, separated by a thin wood or bark spacer, so sweat doesn't dampen the wrapper. In heat, it rides away from the body to avoid the humid exhale of skin. Children learn the weight of a good bundle by heft, the way a loaf tells its bake when you lift it. Too light, and you've starved it. Too heavy, and you've loaded it with fibers that will char into a choking cake. They practice with cold bundles first. Ash bark, a stone warmed by the sun, learning how to roll without crushing, how to pinch ash, how to thread a reed without making the whole ragged. Only later do they feel the hum of a real ember under their thumbs, and they look up wide-eyed when a puff through the tube brings a blush through layers, as if they'd woken a sleeping animal. Troubles draw measures from memory. If a bundle gets wet, you do not despair. You unwrap to the nest under a rock lip, peel away any slick fibers, and bed the ember in a fresh fungal slice dusted with ash, using the old wrapper as fuel to dry the new. If ash clumps and refuses to fall fine, you warm it on a flat stone until it relaxes and sifts clean again. If you have no ash, you can scrape the soft char from the inside of a burned log and grind it between palms until it's powder. Charcoal is not ash, but in a pinch it understands the same job if you use less and watch closer. And if wind makes every breath a risk, you turn the bundle so its pinholes face the hollow at the base of your throat. Let your hand and collarbone become a cowl, and let your pulse set the rhythm of the ember's breathing, while the world rages in gusts beyond the small climate you carry. None of this is magic. All of it feels like it. The ash blanket and the ember bundle take a thing that wants to leap and teaches it to linger. Take a thing that would die and teach it to wait. Somewhere along a wet trail, a carrier pauses and opens the seam just enough to see the faintest jewel of red suspended in the grey and brown. And the sight produces a calm that spreads outward into everything else that must be done. Water to fetch, hides to shake, a child to soothe, a path to choose. Because the heart of the day is beating in your hands and will still be beating when you ask it to rise. The first containers were hands, then cupped leaves, then bark folded the way water teaches you to fold a boat. A strip of birch or lime, peeled in spring when the sap is up, and the bark will bend without cracking, could be softened over steam and rolled into a cone that remembered its curve when cool. The seam was lapped and pinned with thorns or stitched with split root, and along that joint you pricked pinholes with a fish bone, so air would cross the bundle like a breeze under a door. If the forest gave you pine or spruce, you warmed resin in a small shell until it ran like honey and brushed a thin line down the seam to keep drizzle out while leaving the pinholes clean. Inside the cone, a thin spacer, 2 ribs of twig crossed and lashed, kept the ember's nest from pressing flat against the bark, preserving a small cathedral of air where heat could wander without finding a chimney. In wet places, bark alone was not enough, so gourds took the job after the season's drying. A bottle gourd hung from a rafter all summer grows hard and hollow with patience, and when you cut its neck, the pith shakes out like seeds of dry foam. You sand the lip smooth with grit and spit, drill through 4 needle holes near the shoulder with a sliver of flint, and carve a stopper from green wood that will swell just enough to hold but never seal completely. Some travelers made 2 stoppers, one pecked through with a reed for long, steady breath on the march, one nearly solid with only a pinhole for sleeping, so the same container could change temperament with the day. A gourd takes on the scent of smoke and fat until it smells like a small memory of every camp you've made, and its roundness rides a shoulder without biting. In country with shells, a big scallop or oyster shell became a lid over an ember dish pressed from clay, the 2 bound with fibre and sealed around the edge with damp earth that cracks to vents as it dries. A clever accident turned into a method that lets heat whisper out along the fractures. Clay was a leap forward and required a patience that matched the slow life it was meant to carry. You knead the river mud until it stops feeling like grit and starts feeling like bread. Then you pinch a cup no thicker than the little finger and rub it smooth with a pebble dipped in water until it shines. Before it dries, you press a net bit of twig impressions around the outside so your fingers will find purchase in rain. A lid is a shallow dish with tabs like ears. Under the lip, you scratch channels that will become tiny flues once the clay is fired. Firing is as gentle as anything you ever do with fire. A shell of embers, a slow bake within the cooling bones of last night's hearth, rolled and turned and cooled again until the clay rings when tapped. A clay cup with a clay lid can ride all day in a pannier on a small horse or tucked into a cradle net on a back. And if rain finds you, the cup shrugs it off. The lid's ear tabs align with braided loops on a sling so that a twist opens a finger-width gap while you walk. Then another twist closes it safe when you climb. Bone and antler made the first tubes that felt like tools instead of only carriers. An antler beam drilled lengthwise with patience. Char the hole with a hot stick, scrape the charcoal, char again. Becomes a tunnel that breathes evenly along its grain. You cut windows small and oval along the tube and stitch over them. A lattice made from fish skin scraped to transparency and dried, or from the thin inner bark of elm, so sparks cannot leap, but air can slip. One end is capped with a dense plug of wood wrapped in sinew. The other with a cork carved from hardwood pith, tied to the tube with a thong, so it never goes missing in snow. The tube rides like a flute along your breastbone, under a cloak, where your own warmth prevents the kind of condensation that makes ashes cake. To lift a tired coal, you tip the tube and listen for the carbon rattle. A soft chuff says the ember is alive and rolling along its little corridor. People who crossed long grass, where wind prowls low-built cages, little basketry cradles that were stronger than their delicate looks suggested. Willow withies or young hazel were split and shaved with a stone scraper to thin, resilient ribs, then bent in steam around a horn or a knee and tied into an egg-shaped frame. Across that, a weave of spruce roots or nettle cordage made a skin, and inside it, a sleeve of bark or felted fungus could be inserted and replaced when charred. The basket took blows rather than the ember, and because it was open work, it never trapped smoke enough to sour the nest. It was the container you wanted when you had to run. Across the steppe and in dry basins, leather and rawhide earned their place. A wet rawhide pouch stitched around. A stone form dries to a snug pot that can be re-wet to adjust. Before it hardens, you prick a collar of tiny holes near the top with a thorn and lace a soft leather cuff there so you can open and close the throat without stressing the hide. The cuff also drinks a bit of condensation and passes it back as breath, an unnoticed kindness on long marches. With leather, you can sew straps where your body needs them. a crossbody band that settles weight on the hip, a double loop that hangs from a belt and keeps the container from swinging into a rock face when you traverse, a shoulder yoke that centers the ember's weight so your spine doesn't twist after miles. In mountains, people learned to marry materials. A clay pot nested in a basket, suspended by shock cords of twisted sinew, could ride a goat's pack and arrive ready to light a cooking fire without anyone having touched it for hours. A gourd nested in a bark cone rode a child's back like a toy. A bark cone sleeved in leather became a traveler that feared neither rain nor bump. A few bands built multi-chamber carriers like small organs. A clay cylinder divided by interior ribs into 2 or 3 narrow lungs, each with its own pinholes and shared lid. If one ember ran too hot, the keeper could pinch it out and borrow breath from the neighbor, or dedicate one chamber to wake coal and one to sleep coal, giving the day a rhythm of bright and dim without rebuilding a bundle from scratch. Against accidents, there were baffles and catches. A lattice of charred twigs laid across a container's mouth acted as a spark arrestor. A skirt of damp clay smeared thin around the inside collar of a lid cooled any flare that tried to climb. Some carved a tiny shoulder into the neck of a gourd, a ledge where a sliver of stone rested to interrupt rising heat. Others stitched a circle of felt inside a bark cone to catch unburned flecks before they could gnaw a hole. Where rivers ran and crossings were many, carriers made float skins, light bladders of fish, or seal inflated around a container, so if you slipped, the precious cargo bobbed rather than sank, and once ashore, the skin could be unknotted and rolled to the size of a fist. The way a container meets the body matters as much as the way it meets the weather. There is a hollow below the collarbone that cups a small cone as if it were designed for it, held under a strap that passes over one shoulder and under the opposite arm, so that each step presses and releases gently, breathing the ember without thought. A hip carry suits those who climb, the container tied at 2 points so it does not swing. A back carry suits those who watch the horizon, the container in a pouch sewn into the inside of a cloak where the spine warms it and the cloak becomes a wind shadow. Some keepers braided a little bumper, ring of grass rope, around a clay cup so that when it tapped the ribs, it hurt neither cup nor person. Night changes containers too. In camp, an ember can be settled into a cradle rather than a traveler, a shallow hearth made from a ring of smooth stones, the size of fists with a layer of sifted ash within, and a hinged lid of split wood that closes like a book. You lay the ember in its bed, fold the lid, and set a small weight, a stone warm from the fire, on top, so curious hands must ask before peeking. Beside it sits a child's practice cradle, the same build, but the ember is a river stone warmed and dusted with ash, so little hands can learn the motions without risk. And the warm stone remembers heat long enough to teach. Maintenance trails the containers the way smoke trails a fire. Soot accumulates in reeds and tubes, and once a day the keeper sings a breath through while pulling a twist of dry grass or a bird's feather through the reed to brush it clean, listening to the note change from husky to clear. Leather that has seen rain is fed with fat away from the ember and then smoked lightly to set the fat. Bark that has cracked is warmed and rubbed with resin until the seam reads smooth under a thumbnail. Clay that has been shocked by a dropped pack is soothed with a slow bake near the fire's shoulder rather than repaired. When it finally breaks, the shards become scrapers for hides or polishers for beads, because nothing that sat with an ember is thrown without thought. People named their carriers the way they named knives and dogs. A gourd that had ridden 3 winters, patched twice, and darkened to the color of roasted chestnut, might be old drum, and you could tell by the way a keeper handled it that affection and respect live in the same hand. A clay pot with a distinctive ding became bell. A bark cone that never leaked in rain was turn. A tube that purred when you hummed into it was throat. Names are a form of attention, and attention keeps things alive. When bands met, carriers were compared like grandchildren, whole patterns admired, clever stoppers borrowed. A new way of lacing a lid learned in an afternoon that saved someone else a season of mistakes. Regional styles traveled on feet and backs. In the north, where cold makes breath a visible thing, containers biased pinholes inward so warm exhale ran across them. In the south, where heat and dust conspire, lids sat looser and reeds were longer so the keeper could stand in shade, while the bundle rested in moving air. On grasslands, wide, flat cradles sometimes rested on the crown of the head under a wrap, freeing hands for tools. In forests, narrow tubes threaded like bandoliers left shoulders free to slip between trees. Animals learned the sight of them, dogs kept from noses out of habit. Horses knew that the smell of certain containers meant warming mash soon. Goats stopped fidgeting when the clay coffee cup that always came before oats emerged from a sack. Even small birds learned that a person adjusting a lid in the morning might stir insects from a patch of grass and would watch, bold as neighbors, from a twig. All of this gear was only as good as the rhythms it supported. The cleverest container becomes a tyrant if it demands fiddling every quarter mile, and the humblest bark cone becomes a marvel if it disappears into the day, asking only for a breath when you yourself pause for one. So designs that endured were the ones that matched how people already moved. The reed mouth, exactly where your hand falls, when you settle a strap, the lid that opens with the same twist you use to uncap a water skin, the weight that balances the pouch of dried meat on the other hip so your gait stays symmetrical. In this way, carriers and cradles and clever containers slipped from being special objects into being parts of a body's ordinary outline. Heat tucked into the same silhouette as tools and food and stories, an ember riding along in something that felt less like a box and more like a promise you could touch whenever the day grew thin. Resin is the tree's memory of wounds, and that memory burns long. A keeper learns to find it by the nose first, the clean, sharp sweetness of pine that clings even in rain, and by the look of old scars where branches once joined the trunk. A knotty stump dug from sandy soil yields fat wood, streaked like bacon with amber veins that catch with a kiss of heat and then carry flame as if it were a story eager to be told. Split thin, these sticks become matches in the old sense, not sparks in an instant, but lengths of certainty that can be woken, used, and put back to sleep. You shave curls along a stick's edge with a stone blade until a feathered fringe hangs, touch a coal to it, and angle the stick so the flame walks upward into thicker wood. The first lick is showy and brief, the second settles. The third becomes a steady cone that you can hold low to warm hands, high to lead feet, or sideways to light a waiting nest without dropping embers. If the wind hurries the burn, you tilt the brand and feed it more resin, scraped from a wound and warmed on a flat stone until it grows shiny and compliant, so the flame throttles down into a slower, thicker light. Resin alone can be brittle in cold, so some temper it with a smear of animal fat or beeswax if a hive has been found, stirring with a twig until the mixture is the color of tea and the texture of soft cheese. That paste, brushed into the fibers of a twisted rush or braided grass, turns it into a small torch that burns with a steady tongue rather than an angry roar. A good torch is not only a beacon, but a tool for managing embers. You kiss the torch to the coal to wake it bright, carry light and heat through a task, then touch the torch back to the ember's nest, which takes flame and then is choked gently under ash, so the torch can be pinched out and saved, the heat transferred back like a borrowed cup. Torches are built to suit the day. In open country, you bind 3 fat wood splints around a core of dry twig with a spiral of rawhide or inner bark, leaving gaps where air can weave. Melted resin is dripped into the seams, the bundle rolled between palms so the paste wicks inward and stiffens the whole into a single rod. In wet woods, you start with a heart of punkwood wrapped in fungus felt, swab it with resin, then jacket it in thin birch bark that you've toasted over coals until it turns supple and less likely to split. The bark jacket burns like a slow braid, releasing resin smoke that keeps insects at a distance and that smells, to those who have used it for years, like a room where you can think. The handle is shaved clean of pitch and sometimes rubbed with ash so it grips without greasing. A notch is cut near the base to catch a thong, because you will tie the torch to your wrist on cliffs or river crossings where a dropped light could become a lost day. Down in caves, flame behaves like a stranger, so torches change shape again. The head is flattened into a fan, built from overlapping leaf-thin slats of resinous wood bound on a split stick and dipped in a thinner resin mix that dries to a varnish. Fans shed soot better, throw light sideways onto walls where a foot must test holes, and their broad faces can be turned edge on to nose through a sullen draught or held flat to drink the sluggish air when a passage widens. At the cave mouth, the keeper trades the bundle's smolder for the cave torch's posture with practiced economy. The ember is teased open, the fan lowered until a corner catches, the light nursed only to what is needed, and the remaining coal tucked back into its cradle with a few grains of ash, because below ground every breath must be counted, and every breath that feeds a flame takes one from your lungs. There are lamps, too, small as a hand. A shell or a shallow stone cup holds rendered fat, and a twist of plant fiber or scraped bark serves as wick. The wick is laid so that only a whisker peeks above the rim, and the surface is protected from drafts by a collar built of clay or a ring of pebbles, each pebble warmed before placement so it doesn't chill the pool and choke the flame. Lamps like this do not shout like torches. They whisper, they think for you while you work on fine tasks, mending, carving, threading sinew, casting a close light that doesn't blind the night beyond. When it is time to move, the wick is pinched with wet fingers or a flat stone, the fat covered with a leaf to keep sparks from kissing it later, and the ember is asked to take back the job. Between lamp and torch lies the slow match, a length of patience you can coil, tuck, and revive at will. In some places, it is braided from 3 strands of inner bark rubbed with resin paste until they shine, and then dusted with fine charcoal so the smolder has roads to follow. In others, it is a single cord of milkweed fiber twisted tight and then battered with ash lye until the fibers open and drink, then dried in smoke that adds its own learned temper. Sometimes the slow match is a strip of fungus felt rolled around a thread of punk and bound with 2 or 3 loose turns of nettle cord, loose so that breath can slip through, tight enough to keep the shape. And when you lift it to your ear, you can hear the tiny tick of heat moving along like a beetle in duff. The match is lit from the ember with only a kiss, no flame drawn from it, and then it rides in a small tube, bone, antler, or hollow reed, with pinholes to let the smoulder think. When you need a moment of light, you crack the tube, fan the tip, and it will flare enough to carry a coal to a torch head, then be pinched back to ember with a squeeze between two smooth pebbles kept for this purpose. A match that has trudged through rain learns to take help. You press its head into a tiny cup of powdered punk mixed with dust-fine resin, then blow through a reed held a thumb's length away, so your breath arrives as warmth more than wind, and the head will brighten without spitting. If it sulks, you massage it really, rolling it gently under your palm against bark to shake loose soot and reseat ash. Then try again. There is a rhythm to moving between smoulder and flame that becomes a language in the camp. A call from the cook and a brand blooms. A cry from the sentry and a torch wakes hot and loud. A drowsy murmur for a story, and the lamp is stirred up, the wick trimmed with a thumbnail to make a steady halo. Each time, the ember at the center of things is protected from upheaval, because the point is not a bright fire everywhere all the time. The point is a current of heat that can be turned up or down, forked and braided and reunited without break. Resins let you build reserves. A long afternoon near a grove of pines becomes a harvest. You score old scars carefully with a stone flake and collect beads of amber into a leaf that folds like a ladle, never taking too much from one tree, never cutting fresh wounds that would bleed and waste. At camp, resin lumps are warmed in a pot of boiling water so they soften without scorching, then pressed into thumb shapes and wrapped in leaf packets tied with grass so that a pouchful rides light and safe. Those thumb cakes are emergency light, trade goods, medicine for leaking seams, and tinder food, a pinch kneaded into a struggling bundle's nest, can sweeten the breath of an ember that has gone grey in damp. A smear along a torch seam can mend a split. A dab on a wick can lengthen burn without smoke, thick as guilt. In colder country, pitch is cooked more deliberately. Stones are hollowed into shallow basins with patience, pecked, ground, pecked again. Then a cone of bark or an inverted pot is set over a small fire with strips of resinous wood stacked above. The wood warms and weeps, and the pitch crawls down into the stone where it gathers, dark and glossy, stronger than raw resin and less crumbly in frost. While it is warm, it can be poured into lines along torch heads or into little molds to make pellets that can be pushed into joins with a thumb later. People grin at the mess and wear the smears like badges until they fade in smoke and washing, because the smell means you have hours of certainty in your pocket. Not all light is held in the hand. There are pitch fires built in holes, dug into sand or gravel that draw like chimneys. A trench cut the length of your arm with a cross tunnel for wind, the head fed with resin-rich splinters, so the flame rises in a tight column that doesn't wander, and the smoke goes where you mean it to. You can cook at the mouth where heat is kind without licking your knuckles, and you can feed it with sticks poked in from the side without showering sparks. Along rivers, torches ride in holders hammered into driftwood poles, the heads angled out over water so fish are drawn to a trembling circle and then speared by those with patience and a quiet heel. In swamps, torches are hung from forked stands, so hands are free to cut reeds for sleeping mats, and the resin smoke braids itself into the willows until mosquitoes pick a different dream to haunt. Slow matches learn their own travels. A coil smoulders along a marked stick, a notch cut for every finger width of progress, and in that way time is counted when sky and stomach keep poor measure, when to turn the meat, when to wake the next watch, when to pull a glue pot off the heat before it goes brittle. If a storm eats sun and a day needs a spine, the match gives it one. If a child needs a gentle task, the child is told to watch the red crawl to the next notch and call out, and the child learns patience and attention's reward as the coil breathes and the notch arrives. There are hazards that practice answers without drama. Resin likes to spit if it's asked to run too fast, so a torch head is stroked with ash before lighting, a dusting that tames eager spots and gives angry drips a cool bed to die on. Wicks drown in their own success if the fat pool swells too deep, so a flat chip of wood is floated near the wick to steal a little of the bath and feed it back by thin edges. Matches that burn unevenly are split and retwisted with a shy thread of dry grass laid in, giving the ember a narrow road to prefer while the broader road rests. If everything is soaked and stubborn and your patience has frayed, you warm a little resin paste in your palm, smear it on a sliver of fatwood shaved as thin as bark, and cradle that under your bundle's seam while you feed it a careful breath, and the smell that rises, pine and smoke and a hint of meat, will feel like a hand on your back moving you forward. These tools loop back into one another until the line between them blurs. A lamp lights a torch without taxing the ember. A torch relights the lamp after a gust under the lean-to. A slow match keeps council fire and cooking fire cousins rather than twins that quarrel. A resin thumb mends a leak that would have forced a rebuild. A pinch of charcoal scratched from last night's torch head sweetens a bundle that had gone sullen. The point is not variety for its own sake, but resilience, a web of ways that ensure no single failure becomes a fall. When bands trade, you can read a region in its lights. In the north, torches are squat and fierce, built to punch through wind that combs the grass flat. In damp forests, they are taller and leaner, with jackets that shed the drizzle and heads that can be coaxed small under the thick canopy. In open highlands, matches are long and ride in decorated tubes because distances are wide and time is measured in valleys. Along coasts, lamps come in shells whose ridges fit certain fingers as if the sea had turned potter. The work kneads itself into hands. A keeper can pinch a wick to exactly the length that will make it sing rather than gutter without looking. Another can roll a match and tell by feel which section will carry through a shallow ford and which will ask for help. Children try to hum into a reed and discover that sound can make flame think, that a note held steady makes a coal brighten as if it were listening, and they laugh, and then they learn to do it like breathing, so their hands are free. At night on a hill, a trail of small lights moves the way a constellation does when you notice it again after a long talk, points that brighten and soften as jobs ask and are answered with a deeper red heart riding quietly at someone's chest. The steady thing that makes all the bright things easy to ask for and easy to put away. Not everyone in a band keeps the ember. Many can tend it, but a few are asked to listen to it the way a shepherd listens to a flock. The choice isn't always age or strength. It's temperament. The best firekeepers are people whose hands remember gentleness even when tired, who notice small drafts, who wake easily without panic, who take correction from old women with good humor and from children with grace. When a group chooses its keeper for a season, there is no crown, just a strap adjusted to the chest and an exchange of tools. The reed cleaned and handed across, the ash packet tied at the waist, the bundle settled into new arms with a quiet, public breath from the previous holder that says, "Here, take the heart of us and make it beat." That breath is the oath as much as any words, because the craft is mostly breath, slow and aimed, drying or warming. A pulse you can export from your body to a coal as easily as you can lay a palm on a sleeping child and feel them breathe back. The watch begins before dark. A keeper makes a circuit around camp that looks like a stroll but is inventory. Wind direction tested with a pinch of ash let fall from shoulder height. Shelter edges tugged to see if a gust will flutter fabric into flame in the night. A glance at the trees to see which branches might shed sparks back if a flare gets away from the ring. The hearth is trimmed like a garden, stones nudged so their slopes lean inward, damp earth patted into any gaps where embers could roll, a small trench cut on the lee side to catch stray coals and make a cooler bed for ash. the ailing and the very young are placed upwind of smoke where possible. If they must be downwind, the fire is burned low and clean with seasoned wood whose smoke climbs fast instead of pores. Rocks for banking are chosen with care. River stones that once held water may crack from steam if heated too quickly, so they are warmed at the edge and turned a few times before they are trusted near the core. The keeper's kit is set within arm's reach as shadows lengthen. Tongs of green wood that won't char at the first touch. A flat stone for pinching wicks, the reed. A thin stick scraped smooth for teasing ash without shedding splinters. A twist of dry fungus, a loop of cord knotted at intervals that counts the night's watches by finger memory alone. When voices settle, the fire settles with them. The keeper stirs the middle only enough to draw a listening glow to the surface, never enough to make the flames proud. The first banking is a lesson in restraint. Heat is managed like food, enough for now, enough saved for later. A quilt of ash goes over the red, not smothering, not thin. A few holes are left open where the eye can see down to the ember's steady, sunset-colored breath. If someone asks for more light, a needle to be threaded, a thorn to be found, the keeper opens a small window, feeds 2 fingertips of kindling, and closes it again when the task is done. If someone leans in to talk, the keeper reads their clothing as a wick and makes space, not by orders, but by moving a log with ordinary impatience, the sort that changes a room without offense. Many of the rules are like that, habits that avert scolding by making the safe thing the easy thing. Night watches happen in loops that suit the group. Sometimes the keeper stays near the center and rotates duties with others, listening first, mending second, edging sleep third, always with one ear tuned to the ember's language, that soft, collapsing sigh that says a cavity emptied and needs nudging, that tiny hiss that says a wet thing wandered in and should be pulled out before it steams under the ash and sours the bed. Sometimes the keeper walks 3 slow circles into the dark and back, checking how far the fire's scent travels, finding where eyes glitter at the edge of grass, finding where a spark might drift if wind changes, and then returns to sit with back to a log and face to the heat, the ember reflected in their eyes, so anyone waking can see at a glance that the heart is watched. Every hour, more by feeling than by the knot cord, the keeper flexes hands in the warmth. To keep blood from sulking, sips water to keep breath soft, and if the throat is dry and they hum low into the reed to test both themselves and the coal. The hum is not for music, but for control. Blowing can be clumsy in the dark. Humming delivers warmth without gust. a vibration that coaxes the ember to answer in deeper color without sending flakes leaping. There are taboos that protect more than pride. No boasting over a well-kept coal, because pride makes hands hurry later. No scolding a child who watches too close. Send them on an errand for a small stick. Teach them to feel heat with the back of a hand. Give them a thankless job, sifting last night's ash for tomorrow's blanket, so they own a piece of the work. If a spark bites a sleeve, the keeper speaks to the cloth as much as to the person. Hush, hush, while pinching out the ember so the body calms along with the coal. If a gust wakes the bank into a short flame, the keeper lifts a hand before anyone else moves. A promise of timing more than control, and lays a shallow scoop of ash that settles the flare without making smoke so thick it wakes babies. Language is simple, gestures quieter than words, because night has its own delicate balance between watch and rest. When storms test the camp, the watch turns cunning. Rain asks for a lower, tighter bed, with heavier ash and larger coals buried deep like seeds. Wind asks for a longer hearth, so flame can stretch along it like a cat rather than pile into a tall cone that throws sparks. Snow asks for a roof, a tilted slab of bark suspended high enough to catch no heat, but low enough to curb fall. The keeper reads the front's approach by the way fatty smoke lies down and by how sound changes under the trees. They bank early, lay aside a dry coal in a small clay cup with a lid like a mouth, and tuck that reserve in a pocket under a cloak near a warm shoulder. Redundancy quiets worry and makes the main bed easier to manage with patience. If lightning wanders nearby, the fire is flattened, coals spread thin, so there is no proud column to tempt a strike, and a second reserve coal is hidden in a hollow near the edge of camp where rain can't find it, marked with 3 stones nested like eggs so a waker in need can find it blind. A keeper's body becomes a tool. Forearms learn to measure heat without blister. The skin on the inside of the wrist is the thermometer for nests and lids. Fingertips read ash-like texture, telling by feel when siftings are from clean hardwoods or from brush that will cake. The nose distinguishes sweet blue smoke that means steady combustion from the sour brown that means damp rot is smouldering under the bank. The ear hears the small tick of sap in a log that will spit if brought too close and moves it aside, saving a burn that would have become a story told too often. Even sleep is trained. Keepers nap like cats, shallow and near the surface, waking when silence grows strange or when the usual pop and crumble of the bed pauses too long. They wake when a sudden stillness falls, the way you wake when a child's breathing quiets and you do not know why yet. They wake when wind makes a new path between shelters, and the fire answers with a sound like a yawn. Rituals surround the craft, not because the ember is a god, but because rhythm breeds reliability. Before the last talking dies, the keeper tells a short litany that lists the things the fire will do and will not do tonight. Keep hands warm, keep teeth busy, keep wolves shy, not lick the straps, not scare the little ones. And the group answers with a murmur that is half teasing and half serious, because saying it out loud makes minds check for the little stupidities that cause trouble. At dawn, before anyone eats, a quiet thanks is spoken over the first flame that rises from the bank. Not because gratitude feeds the fire, but because it feeds the posture that kept it alive. In between, small courtesies scaffold the hours. If the keeper must step away, they lay the reed across the tongs, a sign that anyone who wanders close should call them back, rather than try a breath without knowing how the bed is built. If someone shivers and reaches, the keeper slides a flat stone from the warm edge and sets it under their palms, lending heat without taxing the bank. If a hunter returns late, the keeper brightens the hearth just enough to guide bootlaces, not enough to blind the night-marked eyes that still need to see past the edge of camp. Not all watch is sitting. On travel days, the keeper is also pathfinder for the ember. They choose where rests happen based on windbreaks and dry ledges rather than pretty views. They notice the shelf of sandstone that drinks sunlight and stays warm through evening, a perfect table for opening the bundle without sucking heat from it. They feel when slope and stride begin to overfeed the ember and shorten steps so breath calms. Crossing water, they face the pinholes away from the ferrying breeze of motion, hold the container high and a little forward so their own wake doesn't curl into it. And once over, they kneel and listen for the coal's answer before they rise. If the world offers a gift, a stump full of punk, a shiver of fatwood, a shelf of fungus clean and dry, they collect it and refresh their stores without drama, because abundance and famine trade places without warning. And the keeper's job is to ride both with the same face. The social part is as important as the technical part. A keeper is granted the right to enter any conversation, to ask for space or quiet, and in return, they offer light for small tasks, a warm stone for sore joints, a flame for a private grief. They become a person to tell secrets to, because secrets, like the company of things that cannot talk back. Children sit near them when they are too restless to sleep, learning by proximity how to move hands without hurry and how to turn worry into work. Elders sit near them when throats are dry, because the keeper's water skin is always near the fire and always warm enough to be kind. Even dogs learn that the keeper's voice means calm. A low murmur and a hand lifted palm down can settle a nervous animal back onto its paws. There are failings and repairs. If a banked bed goes out, a sudden downpour steals into the ring, or a night of talk forgets itself and eats more fuel than sense, the keeper does not wear public shame, because blame makes hands worse and haste more likely next time. Instead, the group uses its redundancies. The coal in the clay cup is woken. The slow match in the reed is uncoiled. The neighbor hearth 2 valleys back that accepted a gift of coals at dusk becomes a lighthouse to walk toward. Those long alliances matter. Bands share fire as they share news, and when travelers arrive, having carried a coal for days, the receiving hearth keeps a pinch of that ash and a small coal from it for a night or two, mingling them with its own bed, so luck and character fold together. A failure becomes a journey rather than a collapse, and the keeper walks it without losing their place in the circle. Training happens in the open. Apprentices are anyone curious enough to ask. They start with cold, as before, ash, nest, wrapper, reed, feeling how a seam should sit, how a tube tastes at the lip, how much pressure tongs can bear before they flex. Then they graduate to tending a false bank, built at the edge with a generous coal and a lot of watchful eyes, learning when a bed that looks safe will suddenly tunnel under a stick and send heat where you don't want it, learning the sound a log makes when it has one more good hour in it versus when it will collapse if pressed. They learn the dawn ritual last, because waking a camp is harder than putting one to sleep. And because people notice mistakes more when they are hungry. When they finally lift a reed and hum and see that blush run under ash in a line that means the day is ready, they grin at the ridiculous pride of it. And no one laughs, because everyone remembers the first time a coal answered them. The watch is not only human. Night birds draw a ring of attention around camp. Their sudden silence is a bell. Insects draw a ring too. When their tone shifts, the keeper looks up, because something has moved that is not wind. The ember itself draws a ring of small lizards on warm nights. They bask at the edge of warmth, and if they dart away as one, the keeper knows a footstep is near even before the dogs lift their heads. Stars draw a ceiling that counts the hours with more accuracy than the knot cord if clouds give permission. A keeper knows which constellation will cross the notch in the hill at halfway and which will kiss the broken branch that points like a finger at dawn. And this makes the night feel shorter, which makes patience easier to hold. And running under everything is the simple animal comfort of the task. Hands warmed and cooled, and warmed again have a rhythm that ends cramps. A face turned to heat, and then to night wind, and then to heat again, is a kind of washing. The ember's glow gives the pupil a place to rest. The ashes' soft fall gives the ear a small rain when the sky withholds it. The watch's care distilled, and the band sleeps, because one person is awake inside that care, and because the ember they guard is a small sun they can ask to rise whenever for the next hour needs it. Weather is a quarrelsome partner, but it can be taught the steps. Rain wants to drown, wind wants to steal, snow wants to numb, heat wants to hurry. Each tries to persuade the ember toward the wrong kind of ending. So the first defense is not gear, but reading. Watching leaves turn their pale undersides hours before the first drops, smelling that clean copper note that rides in before a hard squall, feeling pressure ease in the sinuses, the way a creek slackens before it swells. On those cues, the coal's appetite is tamped early, the nest tightened, the pinholes turned to the ribs, and rests planned where rock overhangs make dry rooms, or where a fallen trunk sheds water like a roof. Rain is less a line than a mosaic. You learn to move from dry tile to dry tile inside it, under leaning birches, through cedar aisles, along the backs of ridges where the wind throws water elsewhere. You carry fat rubbed thin on the outside of bark wrappers, not enough to smoke when warmed, just enough to bead water, and a scrap of oiled skin that can be draped like a visor over the container's face when gusts slap. Moisture is a slyer enemy than a splash. Fog feeds it one breath at a time until fibers sag and ash cakes. To meet fog, you build porches, a spacer of dry twig that lifts the nest off the wrapper's inner wall, so condensate has somewhere to collect and cool. A reed whose mouth is set not at the nest's heart, but slightly above, so you breathe warm air across the surface rather than into it. When wet is certain and long, you make the ember 2 beds. One rides with you, one is cached. A shallow scrape under a rock lip takes a tiny coal wrapped in fungus and ash, the cache marked by 3 pebbles in a triangle, and a ribbon of twisted grass dangling eye-high from a twig. So if the traveling ember fails during a river crossing or a fall, you can walk back to a sure beginning that hasn't soaked with you. The act of caching changes the day's posture. It lets you walk into weather rather than crouch beneath it. Wind has its own cunning. It does not only blow, it breathes in pulses set by valley shapes and forest edges, wakes at sundown on plateaus, sleeps unexpectedly at dawn in gulches where cold pools. A keeper learns the map of these breaths the way a fisher learns eddies, turning the container's seam downwind in gusts and crosswise in lulls, so the ember never gulps. If the land offers nothing like shelter, you make it. A screen woven in a handful of minutes from green willow wands that you push into soil in a half circle, their tops lashed with cord so the whole flexes rather than shatters. The screen rides at your hip when you move, planted upright when you open the bundle to air the coal. On knife-edged ridgelines where wind combs everything one way, you kneel with back to the gale and cloak thrown forward so your body becomes a baffle and the ember's breath is the calm in your lee. Even your stride is a tool. Short steps mean gentle pulses through pinholes. Long strides push air like a bellows, so in a blow you walk like someone thinking carefully, and the ember thanks you by not racing. Cold is a different argument. It steals by thinning flame to blue, by making fat reluctant, by making breath itself sting. The coal does not know cold. It knows how quickly its heat leaks away into what touches it. So you change what touches it. Nests are thicker but looser, ash a little heavier, wrappers held in a sling that keeps the container off wet cloth or frost-packed fur. A thin board of bark between bundle and breast is a surprising kindness, stopping your own sweat from dampening the wrapper and stopping the wrapper from pulling heat too sharply from your skin. In deep cold, you carry stones, flat, dense, warmed at camp, and rotate one in close to the ember for an hour, then swap it for another to set against your belly. A trade of warmth that saves the ember from eating itself too quickly while your body gains cheer. On snowfields, where reflection burns faces and quiet swallows edges, you create a floor before you make requests of the coal. A plank of split wood laid on the snow, a mat of old grass, even a tight braid of stems untwisted later. Anything that keeps the nest and kindling from drinking their first heat into frozen water. If you must sleep on snow, you build a low tunnel of blocks or a drift hollow where breath and ember warm each other. The coal is buried awake in ash with its reed extended to the little dome's air. And in the morning, a single slow breath turns the grey to red without you exposing the bed to the frost's first bite. Thin air at height complicates everything by making sparks lazy and lungs proud. Up there, you do less and aim better. You hum more than blow, because vibration wakes embers without asking for air you cannot spare. You choose denser coals. You shelter every request for flame inside cupped hands or a bowl of bark, never asking the coal to grow larger than the work demands. Bright sun on cold snow makes steam inside wrappers. At noonday rests, you crack seams to vent and then dust new ash where interior walls took dew, because wet ash clumps and clumped ash starves. Heat tries the other direction. It seduces flame into boasting. In desert wind, the ember will sprint if allowed and then die young. So the net around it is woven wider, with more ash and less reactive fibers, and the reed is shortened so you cannot accidentally feed it with a broad lungful. Shade becomes part of the kit, a carried thing, a palm fan of bark, a flap of hide on a toggle, a hat brim held just so over an opened seam while you adjust something within. Hot draws ants and curious wasps. The wrapper's seam is wiped with a smear of bitter plant sap at midday. So sweet resin doesn't invite mandibles. Dust is weather too, and it convinces ash to behave badly. You keep reserve ash in a tight leaf packet inside a skin pouch that has seen smoke, so the powder you need is not contaminated with grit that will scratch reeds and turn to paste in the nest. If a sand squall finds you, you point the bundle into the wind and lay your body over it in a crouch like a boulder. When the squall passes, you open everything and shake out fine grit before it can become a film that wicks heat away. Fog and sea air are a school you attend no matter how old you are. Salt makes metal sulk and fibers cling to themselves, so bone and wood get the nod. Reeds are preferred over tubes with fittings, and cords are waxed with a little beeswax if you are lucky enough to have it, or with a patient polishing of resin until the fibers take a sheen that turns water. Coastal trails offer driftwood and shells, but test patience with unending damp. You move hearths inland by a few steps at evening, so the breath of tide doesn't crawl across ash in the night. You use shells as little roofs over banked coals with a finger-width stone under one edge for drafting. You carry a slender bundle of kelp ribs dried in wind to serve as a lattice that keeps nests from slumping against wrappers when humidity makes fibers go limp. The coal itself is treated like an honored guest, fed small, fed often, and asked to sleep more than flame, because every rise to brightness asks damp air to join, and it will. Storms compress decisions. When thunderheads pile like mountains and wind starts traveling in lines rather than swirls, you set redundancies close. A second ember rides with a second keeper on the other side of the group. A mirror of the first in case a sudden tree fall or a river spate divides the band. The main hearth is flattened early, coals broken apart to more places so no one flare can eat the whole bed. Food asks fire in storms, but cooking flame is asked to grow from a brand that was asked to grow from a small fork of coal, never from the sleeping heart. The more steps between need and core, the safer the core remains. If hail hammers the world into noise, you slide the ember and keeper into the narrow space between two logs laid parallel and roofed with a hide. A slot so mean it barely admits a knee, but so tight the air within is a steady, gentle flow. When lightning lays white across your eyelids, you pull every bright, tall thing down. Torches extinguished, lamps covered, banks smoothed into low breath, because there are nights when invisibility is the best armor. After, when rain runs off the land like spilled grain, you walk high and read paths by their sudden rivers. A bundle opened over running water will drink more than you give it, so you cross to the dry edges and tend there. Sometimes you travel through places where weather is made by stone, narrow canyons that turn a sigh into a blade, talus fields that leak cold from 1,000 hidden caves, flats that catch afternoon suns like basins of fire. In canyons, you learn to listen for the next bend's voice and to set rests at elbows where wind loses interest. You learn to light within the angle of two stones that meet, a V that turns gusts into harmless tumbles. On talus you step light and keep the ember above waist, so the cold river running through the rocks doesn't drink from it. You also keep a warm stone in your waist wrap to offer the coal a shoulder while you pass that sleeping ice. On heat flats, you lay a mat for everything. Coal tools your own knee, because heat from below is a thief too, and you move in arcs from shade to shade, stealing time as you go. There is weather made by animals as well. Locust years turn air to moving teeth and dust. Smoke helps here, resin smoke that tastes like medicine to insects. So you let a slow torch smolder at heel height while you walk through the worst of it, and you face pinholes downwind, so the wrapper drinks some of that hard scent before it ever kisses the nest. Herds in drought raise brown fog that chokes reeds if you walk their wake. You angle away along a low swale where grass holds dirt to soil, and then clean the reed with a grass twist pulled through like a violin string. Bird weather is real. The sudden cool wind that follows a mass of wings through a pass. You feel it and turn the ember's face away from the new draft even before the feathers pass. Tiny signs are the difference between an ember that sulks all day and one that cooperates. The way ants climb before rain, the way the green beads in certain sedges turn dull when humidity drops, the way jackdaws abandon a ridge when lightning is thinking. You build or break your bundle 5 minutes ahead of the sky. If you know those tells and live 5 minutes behind the sky. If you don't, night teaches weather too. Radiant cold settles in bowls. You do not sleep in bowls if you can help it, or if you must, you make a roof for the ember so it sees less sky. The simplest roof is a hand-sized shingle of bark propped an inch above the bundle's seam. That inch is a revolution, a darkness the coal can live under while the stars pour chill into everything else. Dew appears on seams before it beads on grass. You rub seams with a thumb in the dark and can feel slickness begin. Time to rotate the bundle or crack it to vent. And when fog decides to be a person and walk among you, the ember near the chest makes its own climate. Your breath adds to it, and you learn to breathe along the reed in time with steps, so exhale warms, inhale cools, and the coal lives inside a rhythm larger than weather. All of this is less heroism than habit. You do not fight rain. You give it places to fall that are not your coal. You do not defy wind. You let it spend itself on your back and your cloak while the ember lives in the small country under your chin. You do not scorn cold or heat. You slide their hands off the coal with little gifts. Ash, shade, a warm stone, a reed's hum, a second bed waiting under rock, until even hard days pass in a chain of kept promises, one breath folded into the next. The ember drew people inward long before words learned to walk in long lines. It made a circle on the ground that felt like a boundary and a promise, a little country where teeth unclenched and hands remembered stitches and knots, where laughter could spill without scattering into the night. In that circle, customs gathered the way sparks gather on the rim of a pot. There were simple courtesies first. Never step over the fire, because to cross the heart of the circle is to cut a story in half. Never spit into it, because that is an argument with heat itself. Never waste a flame on show, because light is work, and work is food wearing a different shirt. Those rules are older than anyone's grandmother, and yet they are not harsh. They keep things steady, the way a low wall keeps goats out of gardens, not by threat, but by reminding feet what path they meant to take. Around that low wall, songs warmed themselves and grew. The first stories were not memorized, so much as reheated. Someone would drag a coal forward for a moment of brightness, and with that soft flare, remember how the river rose and chased everyone to the hillside 2 springs ago. How the old dog found a path no one else could smell. How a child laughed in the rain, and for that laughter was put on the carrying frame, so no one had to choose between speed and care. Names linked themselves to coals. This one is grandmother's coal that survived the storm under the overturned pot. This one is uncle's coal that lit a wedding torch from a fire nobody else thought was alive. This one is the coal a stranger shared on the day the sky tore itself and threw ice, and nobody had words, only hands. People told those things the way they raked ash, small, slow motions that reveal glow without making a flare, a practical rhythm dressed in memory. Ritual made itself out of necessity and then refused to leave because it was useful and beautiful in the same breath. When a child was old enough to be given the reed, the band did not simply hand it over. The reed lay across 2 stones, and a hush ran around the circle, a tide going out so the child could hear their own pulse. The keeper would whisper the 3 breaths, one to wake, one to talk, one to quiet, and the child would hum rather than blow, because everyone begins with too much pride in wind and not enough respect for vibration. When the ember answered and ran a blush under ash like dawn under clouds, the faces around the circle changed in the same way embers change with breath. Softer, deeper, steadier. A bracelet might be tied then, a twist of bark, a scrap of smoked leather. Nothing that catches on branches, only a reminder that warmth travels with that person now, even when empty-handed. If the child's hands shook, the bracelet shook, and everyone pretended not to see, because shaking is only practice leaving the body. There were offerings that were really agreements with the past. First fire after a long move carried a pinch of old ash in it, a grey memory folded into the new bed so nobody felt like a stranger to flame. First fire after a death burned low and blue, and people fed it quietly with broken sticks, not whole ones, because grief is in pieces, and the sound of small fractures turning to heat feels like a translation no one has to perform out loud. First fire for a birth had a ring of fresh stones around the usual hearth, a second circle that widened the promise. The stones were cool but near heat, like parents who sleep sitting up. And when the child's name was spoken, it was spoken into the hollow between the circles, so that sound had an echo the child could wear. Travelers brought more than news. They brought their own fire's habits, and the hearth learned to speak dialects. A band from the north might sing a waking song that begins with a whisper and ends with a whistle so short it barely counts as sound. A cue for the ember to wake as shyly as fog does in ravines. A band from dry country might scatter a pinch of resin on a banked bed and call that sweetened breath, a trick everyone else quickly steals and pretends to have always known. From the very far away, a woman walked once with a gourd painted with spirals of soot, and when she opened that gourd and tipped it like a cup, 3 coals rolled into her palm, each still alive after days of rain. She spoke no word anyone there knew, but they made room for her in the circle before she even raised her eyes, because some rituals translate faster than language. Smoke made the first written lines, the kind that vanish and leave memory in their place. People learn to throw green fronds for a quick plume, dry leaves for a quick lift, punk for a slow ribbon. Signals grew first out of danger, 3 short smokes, for a broken leg, a long smear of grey if a herd turned, a fat plume if strangers with hard faces took the ridge. And then out of ordinary needs, because it is tiring to walk questions over hills when a small sentence can rise and walk for you. Children watch the sky the way their parents watched tracks, and when a line appeared that did not belong to weather or to everyday cooking, they would call it out, and someone would answer with a mirror of wet bark or a pinch of damp weeds on coals. You could tell how a valley's people were doing by their smoke grammar. Chaos meant famine or invasion or a ritual forgotten. Tidy sky sentences meant people who had time to think of one another. Fire wore clothes for ceremonies. On certain nights when moon was thin as a toe clipping, a ring of cold stones would be set outside the hearth, and each stone would hold a fading coal lifted with tongs and set like a bead. Elders would walk that ring and whisper the names of those who had carried the ember before, and you could see the small dying lights steady at each name, as if pride were oxygen. On the last stone, a coal would be moved back to the bed and woken on the name of the youngest child, and all at once the fire would stop being only a machine for heat and become a line stretching through time that children could step onto without fear. Weddings were a joining of fires as much as hands. Two carriers woke two small torches from two separate embers, and the couple crossed their sticks and touched the tips together until the flames braided, then turned and lit a shared lamp for the first night. That lamp slept in a clay cup with a pierced lid and travelled with them into seasons nobody else could walk for them. Taboos wrapped the ember the way ash does, not smothering, seasoning. It was bad luck to count coals out loud, not because numbers angered flame, but because counting turned attention outward, and the ember liked attention that stayed near. It was forbidden to curse while blowing through the reed. If you had anger, you went to the dark edge of the circle and spoke to your own hands until you could return. It was disallowed to drag a smoking brand without lifting its head, because the trail of sparks was a lazy danger, and laziness is contagious. These were not laws exactly. They were reminders that heat is a hard-won ally, that human care is the only spell anyone has, and that contempt for small things breaks big ones faster than accident does. Stories braided technique so that neither could be dropped without dropping the other. The tale of the woman who stole winter's heart by banking a coal in the hollow of a bone and walking uphill for 7 days is a lesson in using insulation and gravity. The riddle of the old man who could keep an ember in rain by making it sleep under a shell and feeding it. The smoke of leaves teaches condensation control. The boast of the trickster who carried a coal in his mouth until his tongue learned to tell the truth is a warning about bravado disguised as a joke. Laughter made lessons stick where scolding slides off. A child will remember for life that the trickster burned his lips because he would not listen. And that memory will keep a reed between lips and coal forever after. Season markers used fire to set their hooks deep. First frost, the hearth is turned and rebuilt from new stones, so last season's cracks don't repeat mistakes. First thunder, an ember is shared with the neighbor camp, whether they need it or not, because alliance is easier to maintain than to build from nothing. First salmon or first ripe fruit, the first bite is held above the smoke, so it knows it is welcomed by the house and not stolen like a fox might. When the sun stalled in winter and began to crawl back, people figured this out by sticks and shadows, but fire made it feel true. A long, slow match was lit and set to creep around the encircled hearth while everyone slept. In the morning, that blackened path, like a necklace, was evidence that time had moved, and the day could start with less fear. Morning and fire lived in a careful friendship. Flames were kept modest for a time, not from meanness, but because the world felt too loud when grief was new. A small lamp burned for 3 nights, and its wick was trimmed by those who wept the most, so their shaking had something to do besides shake. The ember bundle might be carried by someone else for a few days, not as punishment to the keeper, but as permission to be only a person for a while, and not also the band's heartbeat. Ash from the hearth was sometimes streaked on cheeks, not to dramatize sorrow, but because a grey touch to skin makes you feel the same gentleness you owe the coal. And gentleness is the only medicine that always helps. Trade made treaties, and they were sealed with heat. A traveler could walk into a camp holding a live coal and, without speaking, offer it open-palmed. To accept was to promise non-violence for a night. To refuse was not quite a threat, but certainly not a welcome. At larger meetings, when groups came together the way rivers do, a news had to be sorted from bragging. A fire from each band was banked, and then a new hearth was made from a pinch of each. A blending that meant the council answers to nobody's soul history. Disputes cooled there faster than in single-owner fires because everyone could smell their own home in it, and a person is less likely to kick apart a hearth that carries their grandmother's slow smoke along with their rivals. The ember taught time in other ways. Children counted breaths between blushes as if the coal had a heartbeat they could match. Adolescents marked their patience by how far a slow match could creep while telling a tale without letting it flare. Adults learned to read the hinge moments when a banked bed needed a nudge and when it needed to be left alone, even if the urge to meddle was strong, and that reading bled into other parts of life, knowing when to push a friend to speak, and when to keep them company in silence, knowing when to move camp because the land's story had changed, and when to sit still and let tiredness unlearn itself. Fire made a metronome for feeling, and feeling is a thing that breaks less when cadence is nearby. Even play bent toward flame. Children laid tiny stone circles and cooked imaginary berries, stealing ash pinches and trying to fold them over warm pebbles with solemn faces that made adults bite their cheeks to keep from grinning. During festivals of rain, when work shrank and laughter swelled, people played games. Who can wake a coal with the softest breath? Who can carry a brand across a stream without a hiss? Who can tell a tale to the ember and make it glow at exactly the same moment every time? And there were prizes that were really lessons. A new reed cut smooth, a little pouch for ash that folds cleverly, a seat closer to the keeper for a week. The ember listened and did not mind being a judge. It likes attention that is careful, and games are careful when they are made by those who live together. In dark seasons, when skies sulked and food was humble, stories grew longer and the circle drew tighter, and people talked about the first time anyone noticed that hot stones dropped in water make water steam, and how that discovery turned 1,000 hard vegetables into soups, and how soups turned hunger into patience because chewing wasn't loud enough then to drown fear. They told how smoke bent across a doorway keeps biting flies from counting you as a meal, how sparks walking up a bark cone look like stars returning to their rooms, how faces look younger from below because flames smooth shadow, and how elders are grateful for any light that makes them look like the memory of themselves. Fire was not a god, or a pet, or a servant. It was a neighbor with excellent manners whose company improved everyone else's, and the customs that grew around it kept that neighbor willing to stay, even when weather, anger, and luck all argued for leaving. When band and hearth had been together long enough, the fire had a personality everyone could recognize. It burned taller when fed elm than when fed beech. It pouted on misty mornings. It bragged a little after cedar. It sulked if nobody sang while stirring stew. People spoke to it the way they speak to a good tool or a helpful dog, half joking, half serious, mostly grateful, and the ember answered with a red that held steady during disagreements, with a smoke that leaned kindly toward the one who coughed, with a heat that made the place where feet met earth feel like a promise kept. In that way, ritual and story did what bundles and ash blankets also did. They taught a bright, hungry thing to live with people, and they taught people to live with one another in the small weather the ember creates. Continuity breeds tools the way heat breeds light. The habit of keeping a small coal alive long enough to remake a hearth at dusk becomes, step by step, the habit of shaping the world so that warmth is always within arm's reach. A banked bed under ash grows into a banked oven where bread learns to rise and brown. The ring of stones around a campfire grows into walls thick enough to store yesterday's heat through the cool of morning. The ember nested in fungus becomes charcoal mounded under sod and smothered just so, a darker, cleaner fuel that burns hotter and steadier and lets metal think about changing its shape. The first person who noticed that wood turned to something more obedient when it was half burned and deprived of air was not aiming for an age of iron. They were solving fatigue, making a hearth that asked less of hands on wet days, and the solution walked forward and found other uses the way a river finds more valleys than the one it set out to cross. Charcoal gives bellows a reason to exist. Bellows give ore something to hear. A pile of blackened wood and a stone that weeps red when heated learn to talk in a shed that is only a hearth with ambition. And soon there is a bloom of metal where there was once only rock. The bloom is stubborn. It must be hammered the way arguments must be hammered, with rhythm and attention, until a blade or a hook or a chisel shakes itself free from slag. Every blow is a breath by other means, every reheat a reminder of the ember's patience. An ash still blankets the day on the floor to keep sparks from biting feet, on the iron to slow cooling, in the quench to season temper. The smith's fire is a direct descendant of the traveller's coal, still moderated by pinch and draught, still taught to linger rather than leap. Only now it makes hinges and ploughshares and needles that multiply a village's reach. Kilns rise from that same schooling in moderation. The idea that clay changes forever when it learns the right heat for the right time is a thought that belongs to people who have spent lifetimes measuring breath and ash, who know that too much is as useless as too little. A clamp of bricks becomes a kiln that fires more bricks, and soon walls hold heat through winter nights and let smoke climb a chimney rather than lie down across sleeping faces. Glazes learn to flow. Pots learn to ring. The sour taste of water kept in raw clay jars is replaced by a clean coolness held behind a hard skin coaxed to glass by a hearth that has learned to count. Inside those jars ride oils made from olives and seeds, fuels that burn in lamps, with wicks twisted to drink at a pace chosen by hands, light you can carry to your work and set down without asking a coal to move. Signals grow taller as people learn to live farther apart. A hill that once hosted a watchfire for wolves now holds a tower where flames talk between towns, slow messages trustworthy as dawn, asking for help, warning of strangers, celebrating a harvest. In harbors, the same logic is stacked in stone and lit with resin, and later with oil, a beacon that persuades water travelers they are not alone, that their return is expected, that land remembers them. The lamp in the tower is only an ember writ high, banked behind glass, against wind, the way a coal is banked under ash against rashness. And below, in houses clustered like barnacles against winter, little flames are married to time. Candles are poured and dipped until wax could be measured in hours. Notches are cut in sticks and slow matches are coiled, so a telling or a prayer takes exactly as long as the flame takes to walk a mark. Timekeeping, once a thing you felt in ribs and saw in stars, finds a partner in steady fire that can be asked to repeat itself. Even law and measure borrow from the hearth. A town counts itself by its fires. How many chimneys, how many ovens, how many households that need grain and salt and cloth. Agreements are made by lamp. This promise lasts while a taper burns. This watch is yours until the wick has shortened to the knot. The meaning of home is a bright spot under a roof rather than just a windbreak. And people talk of carrying their fire to another dwelling as if they were moving a heart from one chest to another, which in a way they are. In certain squares and temples, flames are kept that are not allowed to die. They are tended by people who specialize in continuity the way smiths specialize in heat. A city with a perpetual flame is a city that thinks of itself as having a single long breath, and embers from that breath light other rooms, civic, private, ceremonial, so that identity feels like something you can touch and coax. Meanwhile, small technologies refine the art of not starting from nothing. Iron strikes flint, and a small star falls into tinder, a quicker cousin to the ancient coal, and travelers carry steel and a stone in a pocket where gourds and bark cones once hung. A tinderbox is a miniature hearth, complete with ash, and a bed of fungus felt that has learned to love sparks. The discipline remains identical. Keep it dry. Feed it only what it can use. Never show off. Gunpowder demands its own slowness, a match that burns like a creeping thought rather than a flare. So soldiers and guards nurse cords that smolder all day, coiling and uncoiling them like rosaries of heat, learning the same voice of ember through a different material. Later, heads struck on roughened paper bloom into tiny tulips of fire, convenient and fussy. And even later, a wheel in a brass throat scrapes sparks into fuel in a pocket machine that answers in any weather with a little sun. The object changes. The posture does not. People still cup hands around the first moment of flame, still turn their backs to the wind, still speak to heat in a tone that sounds like respect, even when the words are jokes. Houses grow chimneys the way trees grow trunks for air. Smoke is led up and out so that rooms can fill with other breaths, steam from stews, the damp of laundry, the sharp happiness of yeast rising, and the red of the hearth becomes the stage where families watch one another's faces, learn and forget, and learn again. From the hearth's lintel hang irons that hold pots at the right distance from patience. From its ashpan are taken the ingredients for soap, because people discover that the white siftings stir with fat to make clean where there was only smear. Even in cities where fuel stacks at cost and smoke makes quarrel with lungs, there are small lakes of light set into walls. Fireplaces, braziers, stoves of tile that bank heat behind coloured skins. The tile stoves are cousins to the ash blanket, heat that is captured and persuaded to linger. Only now it lingers overnight and makes morning kinder to bare feet. Guilds and trades rise on the ember's logic of continuity. A baker keeps a starter the way a firekeeper keeps a coal. It is fed and rested, tested and shared, and its health is everyone's breakfast. A potter keeps a kiln seasoned, firing gentle loads after heavy ones, reading the soak of heat in bricks the way a traveller reads glow in fungus. A glassworker learns that heat has thresholds of truth, too low, and sand is only stubborn, too high, and colour runs away. They ride the middle as if on a horse, reins in one hand, breath in the other. Even a brewer thinks like a fire steward. Yeast likes a certain warmth, too cold and it sleeps, too hot and it dies. So rooms are built and vents are shaped, and seasons are chosen so that living things can keep living through a craft. Cities learn that fire is both ally and judge. Streets are widened to keep flames from leaping house to house. Hooks and pumps and ladders and leather buckets are set where hands can find them behind drowsy eyes. Night watchmen walk with poles and rattles and call the hour against the sound of banked coals sighing in 1,000 homes. After each big burning, laws change. Roofs give up thatch for tile. Walls surrender pitch for plaster. Kitchens step back from stairwells. Hearths gain iron throats and dampers that say when to breathe and when to be still. People grumble. Change always tastes of ash at first. But in the next winter, their rooms are warmer and their lungs less heavy. And they admit, around the same hearth, that wisdom is a slow match too. Meanwhile, in monasteries and in lonely towers, lamps are kept near parchment and stone, so words and maps can learn to endure. And in courts and councils, candles mark procedure, burned low to end talk that likes to go on forever. Out in the open, the ember's descendants draw lines across distance. Railroads run on fire, disciplined to push pistons. Steam is bottled breath that does not lose patience on hills. Ships carry furnaces that turn raw water sweet and run lamps that make their names visible to one another on moonless nights. Even the first photographs are written by light whose intensity is managed like a kiln's. Hold back, expose, develop, fix, all timings chosen with the same care as a breath down a reed. At the edges of towns, factories find that heat scales, and then discover that it can also escape. Engineers become keepers, learning how to bank entire rooms, how to shroud roaring mouths with brick that drinks and returns warmth. Safety becomes a craft unto itself. Shutoffs, valves, walls that hold, floors that do not catch, training that turns panic into sequence. Where there is fire large enough to move a train or melt a bloom or boil a vat, there is always someone nearby who thinks like an ember carrier, asking not how large the flame is, but how trustworthy its tomorrow will be. The language clings even when fuels change. Pilot lights, tiny persistent guardians, watch over stoves that no longer eat wood, whispering a promise of instant flame. Furnaces keep coals no bigger than a thumbnail, alive inside metal guts, so a building's breath never goes cold. Lighters carry sparks in pockets like talismans. Candles find their role in rites and birthdays and hospital rooms at 3 in the morning, where a small bead of light next to a sleeping face is worth more than any lamp. Festivals send flames walking again, from house to house on certain nights, from city to city in relay on others, because the old truth still feels like truth. That meaning is stronger when it is not made from scratch each time, but is carried from before to after, without a break you can point to. Even ash keeps working. In fields, it returns minerals to soil, the way stories return courage to people. In vats, it strips hair from hides and makes them ready to become shoes and harnesses that turn walking into multiplication. In cloth, it lifts stains. In pencil marks, it is the ghost of burnt vines healed to write. The grey left after a meal is not waste. It is a ledger of what was burned and what remains useful. And reading that ledger is a craft a household learns, as practical as counting stored grain and as satisfying as seeing tomorrow's bread rise under a cloth. What remains through all the transformations from ember bundle to flint, to box of matches, to the shrug of a wrist that flowers a butane flame, is a posture toward heat that is older than copper and as current as a kitchen at dusk. Continuity over spectacle, patience over panic, insulation and breathing over conflagration. The knowledge that small, steady things Let big necessary things happen on time. A coal glowed in a fungus cradle, and a camp moved safely through 3 days of rain. A charcoal bed was choked at dawn, and a smith made a hinge that kept a door from crying. A pilot flame flickered in a steel throat, and a family ate soup in winter without waiting on kindling. A handheld lighter touched wick to wick at a vigil, and a street crowd saw one another's faces without the glare of anything louder than grief. The thread runs through all of it like a slow match curled in a pocket, ready to be asked for a little more light and a little more warmth. Without fuss, the same quiet heart beating in different housings, while hands continue to do what they have always done. Cup, shield, breathe, share, and then tuck the ember back to sleep, so it can be asked again. If this quiet journey kept you company, let the ember rest and leave a like, subscribe for more gentle histories, and share which moment stayed glowing for you in the comments. Until next time, may your night be warm, your worries banked under ash, and your dreams lit by a patient coal. Good night.